My name is Tania Shah, and I'm very excited to talk to you about real property today. Property has several aspects to it, and while it might not seem as sexy as something like criminal law, it's actually quite interesting, and you're going to learn about a lot of things that you thought you knew, but it turns out you may not have. So first, what I want to do is I'm going to do an introduction to property. Mainly because I want to show you how we're going to go from subtopic to subtopic so you can sort of get the whole big picture of what you're going to be learning in your class. Now, some students have property for 1 semester, and some students have property for 1 year. The great thing about these little videos is that even if your professor goes in, say, a slightly different order than we're going to go, you can, of course, just pick the subtopic that you're working on for that time and click on that. So first, let me start with an introduction to torts and see what we're going to be learning about. So as you see on this first slide here, we start with acquisition of property. So acquisition of property is basically what I said. Is it really founders, keepers, losers, weepers? What happens when you find abandoned property, mislaid property, forgotten property? Who gets it and why? The next we're going to talk about is adverse possession. Now, you may not have ever heard this before walking into your law school class. It's really interesting. It's basically how to own property that does not belong to you. It's not really that easy to do, but believe it or not, people have done it. Next, you're going to learn about estates in land and future interests. Basically, it covers all the types of property ownership that there is, here in the present and in the future. And trust me, there are a lot of those. Next, you're going to talk about concurrent ownership. And just as it says on the slide here, let's all share this property. What happens when more than one person has a claim to a particular kind of property? On this next slide, we will go on to what we call easements. Easements are not a right to own the property, but they are a right to use the property. Next, you're going to learn something called restrictive covenants and equitable servitudes. Restrictive covenants are those restrictions that are placed on property for people who are privately owning them. That is, the restrictions are not placed on by a public entity or the government. They're placed on among the private homeowners about ways to use and not use property. A perfect example is something like a restrictive covenant that restricts property to single-family homes as opposed to multifamily homes. Next, you're going to learn about the contract for the sale of land. Sounds like exactly what it states. Basically, how do we enter into land sale contracts? And some of the things that you're going to learn about have to do with how important it is to have certain things in writing. Next, you're going to learn everything you ever wanted to know about mortgages and probably more. That is, what does a borrower have to do in order to obtain a mortgage? What is a mortgage? What does it do? And things like that. Next, you're going to learn about deeds. Deeds are pretty much the key to your property. Now, not the physical key, but it is that document that says everything about your property and your type of ownership of the property. On the next slide, as you can see in continuing our introduction, you're going to learn about seller's liabilities. Now, if the borrower has to have an obligation in order to get a mortgage, the seller has to have some obligations too. I think that seems only fair. Next, you're going to learn about recording acts and what we call bona fide purchasers. Recording acts are really interesting. It's sort of like you think you own a property, but you don't necessarily own it, because it really actually happens to be about what other people have certain claims to your property. Then you're going to learn about nuisance, which is basically stop bothering my use of my property. It's very annoying. pretty much exactly how it sounds. Then you're going to learn about water rights. Yes, they actually exist. And finally, what we're going to learn about is something called the right to lateral and subjacent support. And that's basically your right not to have your property sink into the ground by your neighbor's use. Something like that. So without much further delay, I'd really like to go on to our first segment, which is about acquisition of property.